So this is the video everyone's been asking for. Brunner versus Simionic. Two awesome force feedback yokes, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. This video is a full comparison of build quality, software, force feedback, and most importantly, value. Both of these yokes will deliver convincing force feedback effects through the control wheel using pitch and roll axis, along with various other effects, giving you the feeling of really flying through your hands. Let's get straight into the design and build quality and look at the physical traits first. You can see here that the Brunner is slightly shorter and wider, while the Simionic is much longer through the base. There's a reason for this, which we will cover later in the video. The Simionic control wheel is larger in width than the Brunner, but the handles in the Brunner wheel are much thicker and chunkier. The Brunner control wheel is modelled after a Beechcraft, and the Simionic after a Cessna. Both yokes have a full metal base and solid mounting holes for screwing to a desk. The finish of the base on each of these yokes is comparable. Maybe the Brunner's slightly better finished when you really look close at the finer details. The Simionic has an on-off switch at the back. The Brunner does not. So when using the Brunner, I always have to make sure my full setup is switched off at the wall when not in use or overnight. The Brunner is heavier than the Simionic by almost 1 kilogram. Both yokes up until now are fairly comparable with a few minor exceptions like the size, but it's going forward that things are going to start to change a little. So the build quality, there's a clear difference here, and it's all to do with the yoke wheels. The Simionic yoke wheel feels much cheaper than a Brunner. It's the only way to put it. While it doesn't really flex, the plastic is a little creaky. I mean, it doesn't affect the use of the yoke, but the Brunner is very much a contrast to that. No creaking, no noise, no flex, and the plastic finish on the Brunner yoke wheel is quite a lot nicer. The Brunner yoke wheel is on another level. It also is a clear win with the sheer quality of the buttons. The POV switch, the trim switches again are just another step up. In terms of the yoke wheel rod, there's also less play on the Brunner. And I think that also plays into the noise of both yokes, which I'll talk about soon. Overall on the design and build quality, the Brunner in my opinion is beating out the Simionic by a clear margin, just based on the control wheel alone. It's really the control wheel and the switches that are the big difference here. Now let's talk about the features. So the Simionic relies on XPForce software, while the Brunner has its own CLS-E software, which is a large advantage. I'll go into that later in the video. Both yokes have 180 degrees of full rotation, just like a real yoke in a plane. The Simionic has 140 millimeters of linear pitch travel, while the Brunner has 90 millimeters. This is also why the Simionic base is a little bit longer than the Brunner. So the 140 millimeters of pitch travel could be a deciding factor for you, but I'll talk about that more when we go through the feeling of flying. Forces wise, the Simionic has 2 Newton meters of rotational force, while the Brunner has 1.7 Newton meters of rotational force. And that's a little bit odd here, as the Brunner actually feels like it has more grunt than the Simionic. Now, this could be because of the smaller yoke wheel. I'm not quite sure, but that's just how it feels. On linear pitch force, both of them have the same 40 newtons of force, and they both feel, I'd say, pretty comparable here. Now let's talk about the software, as this does form a large part of the success of both yokes, but it also widens the margin in Brunner's favour. The biggest thing of concern for the Simionic is that it relies on old software that it doesn't own, called XPForce. There's a link to that in the description. I believe Simionic is working on its own software, so that might change in the not too distant future, but for now, that's just how it is. On the other side, Brunner owns and updates their own software, which is a massive advantage in the yoke, and it translates into a better experience all around. The Brunner software is much more in depth than XPForce. You can basically tune the Brunner within an inch of its life to the type of sim you're building or how you want it to feel. With XPForce on the Simionic, yes, it's a bit simpler to use, but that's because there's just far less you can do with it. So the feeling of force feedback is great on both of them. Both of them inject a sense of realism into the sim that will blow your mind. If there's anything to take away from my initial impressions and the months I've spent flying in both of these yokes, the Brunner feels more realistic in the hands. The Brunner just feels like it's much sharper, it's it's more responsive than the Simionic. Some of the extra effects you can achieve in the Brunner CLS sim software, like engine vibration, prop wash, the weight of the elevator, the stick shaker, it's just all that little bit better. The yoke as a whole and the software combined, it just feels like a step up. Now, don't get me wrong, either of these yokes are great. But when we're trying to split them apart, these are the things that we look at more closely. Something else to mention is the noise. Now, Simionic's force feedback, especially any type of stick shaking effects, turbulence, you know, it's quite noisy compared to Brunner's silence. I mean, even when the Brunner starts to go nuts on you, it's silent, it's tight feeling. The Simionic, in comparison, is just slightly rattly. I did mention earlier that the Yoke control rod on the Brunner is tighter with less play, but maybe that's kind of feeding into this. Pricing, well, both of these yokes are quite expensive. Simionic comes in at $1,100 and the Brunner at 1,320-ish USD when you convert it from euros. So the only people buying these are the absolute diehards, you know, the immersion junkies, if you like. Even at these prices though, what both of these yokes will do for the experience in your sim is quite incredible. And it's clear that force feedback belongs in flight sim. So for me, the value is there in both of them, but what would I recommend? Well, I'm not going to recommend that you buy anything, but I will tell you which one I'd personally pick, having experienced both of them in depth, and I'll also tell you why. With everything we've covered, build quality, software and features, I would pick the Brunner. And there's a few solid reasons for this. One, it runs its own software and the software is way more in depth. Two, the effects are just more convincing in my opinion. Three, the quality of the Brunner yoke wheel is just, it's on another level compared to the Simionic. And four, the Brunner's just super quiet. It's smoother and it's more responsive. So after those four reasons why I would pick the Brunner, there are two that might make you consider the Simionic. So the first one being the price. If you've got a firm budget and that 1,100 USD is, you know, you can't go over that, then clearly Simionic is the choice. And two, if you really want that 140 millimeters of travel, which is nice and it could be important to some people, but that's definitely something to keep in mind. So just how far apart are these yokes? I was trying to figure out a way to illustrate this, and this is what I've come up with. If the Brunner's price was to stay at 1,320 US dollars, what price would the Simionic need to be to make this a much, let's say, a harder buying decision? Well, I think the Simionic would certainly need to be selling in a different price bracket for under $1,000 maybe. Actually, and you know, I think closer to $900. If they could get it to $900, that's going to make a much harder purchasing decision. But right now, these two are they're too close in price for the difference in build quality and the experience that you'll get. The step up in quality of the software, the force feedback effects, the smoothness, the quiet operation of the Brunner is really leaving some work to do for Simionic. So as I said, at the current prices stated in this video, Brunner's the clear winner for the moment. Unless you really need that 140 millimeters of travel or you have a tight budget constraint. Overall, these two yokes are great, they really are. They're paving the way for a bright future in force feedback and flight simulation. No matter which one you choose, I reckon you'll be amazed at the level of immersion force feedback brings to your sim.